Whenever I'm out and about, I always look on the roadside or at the wood pile, or I ask friends to save little bits and pieces of wood because I can turn anything into a sign and flip it and make a little bit of money. So I have some salvaged wood that I've had in a pile for a while. I'm going to turn them all into signs. There'll be lots of tips and tricks here for you to try yourself if you want to make some of these and make a little bit of extra money. First project that we're going to work on is, I think this is off the back of a chair. I found it in the wood pile at the dump and it probably had broken, and this was off of the top. One bonus was somebody had already painted this black, which I love. So I'm just gonna distress it and make it look rustic and not repaint it. I used an 80 grit sandpaper and I love the color of the wood peeking through. Just finished it off perfectly. Now I'm going to use my wax, and I'm just going to wax that whole frame, and it just makes everything pop even more. And the back of it, I'm eventually going to paint it, but for now I've just cut a piece of pressboard, and that's what we're going to turn into our sign. Painted it with some black chalk paint, and then I'm putting some candle wax all around the outside just to give it a distressed look, and it's going to fit right into the back of that frame perfectly. Now we're going to get at the graphics. If you've been following along, you know I love using my Mod Podge reverse graphic transfer method. That's how I'm going to make this sign. Using my Mod Podge mat, I've printed these graphics off on my LaserJet printer, making sure to reverse the text on regular computer paper, making sure that it's lined up exactly where I want it, and I've let it sit for 24 hours now, dampening the paper and then rubbing it all off, and we're left with beautiful graphics on this piece of pressboard that we're going to put in the back of that chair. I'm going to seal everything up with some polyacrylic sealer, and then I had these little tiny nails, and I'm going to nail that pressboard into the back of that chair frame. So here's the before, that old frame off the back of a chair, I think, and I have upcycled it into this gorgeous sign. And I love this quote. It's available in my Etsy store if you want to grab it and make one of these signs for yourself. Always be on the lookout for any type of salvage wood that you can turn into a sign, because they sell really well. Next project that I'm going to tackle is this barn board with the hinges. It looks like it was obviously a door of some sort, and I'm going to upcycle it into something beautiful. I had this plaque that I picked up at the thrift store, was stained, some of the lettering had rubbed off, so I painted it with some of my black chalk paint, and then I dried it to speed up the process with my heat gun. This was a piece of paper that I printed on, coffee stained it, really wrinkled it up, and I'm going to decoupage it on the front of that plaque, just using some Mod Podge mat. Once the Mod Podge has dried, I'm going to seal everything up with a matte polyacrylic sealer. The nice thing about all of these projects is the only cost that I have in them is a little bit of the cost of product. Everything else was found and was free. That way I can make a good profit when I go to sell it. And I had these rusty old screws that I saved off another project, and that's how I attached the plaque to this barn board. I love the way that this turned out. This actually might be staying with me. That's one of the problems I have. I create these things and then I can't get rid of them. Okay, next piece of salvage wood. I have absolutely no idea what this was, but somebody spent a lot of time cutting this out and then they just discarded it. So saw the potential, brought it home. This one is going to turn out fantastic. I have a really great idea. I'm gonna layer up lots of chippy paint on this. First step, I'm using my candle wax. I'm putting candle wax all around the outside and the inside of this salvaged wood, and then I'm painting over top of that with some homemade black chalk paint. If you've never made homemade black chalk paint, I'll put a link down below in the description so you can make a batch yourself because it works fantastic. Now we're going to be really aggressive with this candle wax. I'm applying it over all of this black chalk paint. Anywhere you put candle wax is going to have the paint that you put on top of it not stick very well. And I have got this beautiful acrylic paint that I'm putting on top of this. This is just acrylic paint that I picked up at the dollar store, but I love the teal color of it. Once it was dry, I went back with the candle wax again and was really aggressive. Applied it all over, got out that yellow paint that I love. I'm almost at the end of this tester with the yellow paint. Let it dry completely, and then I'm putting the candle wax on top of that again. Now I've dried that paint completely, and I've also softened up that wax with the heat from the heat gun. Using my scraper, I'm scraping away at that paint, and anywhere there was that candle wax, you're going to bring up those colors from underneath. So look at all of this beautiful chippy texture that I've created just with a little bit of paint and candle wax on a free piece of wood. Now for the back, I just found this piece of wood I had in my stash, and I'm going to paint it with some black chalk paint, and then I'm going to put some of that yellow on, and we're going to give it a little bit of a textured chippy look also before we turn it into a sign. Now all of my signs I sell locally. I'm very fortunate, but there's many ways that you can sell them. Facebook Marketplace, on Etsy, you can go to craft sales, or if you have a booth, these all sell really well. And when you don't have to pay anything for the wood, all you have is the cost of your products to make them, you can have a higher profit and have more money in your pocket, and you can be really creative in the process. I designed this graphic, and I think it's going to work perfect on this piece of wood. Doing my Mod Podge reverse graphic transfer method. Now I have a full tutorial on how you can size your graphics. I had to do this in 2 or 3 steps so I can get all the right sizes of the graphics to fit on this piece of wood, and it sized up and worked perfectly with this graphic. It's available in my Etsy store if you want to grab this one. If you're a tea lover, it's a must graphic. I'm going to use my hot glue gun and press that piece of wood in its spot, and then I'm going to go in and just tack it in with some of those little nails and paint the back so it looks nice and neat. I'm just taking some 80 grit sandpaper and I'm sanding this down because it had a really glossy finish on it, and I want my paint to be able to adhere to it. So taking it right down to the bare wood. I have some wood filler. I'm going to fill up those holes, let it dry, and then get painting. When I'm making my signs and I want them to have that distressed old look, I always start with the base black. I find when I'm sanding it afterwards, that black peeks through and it just gives it that aged look. But that's my preference. You don't have to do that step. Now, if you missed my video on how to DIY your own silicone molds, you have to go back and watch it after this video, because you can make your own molds and you can incorporate it into so many different DIY projects. This is a mold that I used with a stamp, and I am going to incorporate this into my sign using some air dry clay. Pressed it into the mold, and I'm just going to make sure the back is nice and flat, and then we're going to peel it out, and I have this gorgeous air dry clay piece that I can put on my sign. I'm going to clean it up a little bit and then set it aside and let it dry. Now this is the next day. I used my Gorilla Glue to glue that clay embellishment on the top, and I'm just putting on a couple coats of my white homemade chalk paint and taking in and just dry brushing around that mold with a little bit of that black chalk paint, and one last distressing around the outside. If you're a seamstress or love to sew, you're gonna love this graphic. Same process, Mod Podge reverse graphic transfer method. As far as making signs, this is the most affordable way. You don't have to buy vinyl, you don't have to buy stencils. All you need is a little bit of Mod Podge paper and a printer. And you don't even need a laser jet printer. You can do this process with an inkjet printer also. And I have some videos comparing those two printers together so you can see the difference. I printed these graphics off on 2 or 3 different sheets, sizing them up the way that I wanted them to fit on the sign, and it is absolutely beautiful. I love it. I love this graphic. Again, it's available in my Etsy store. So I've taken that boring piece of pine, and this is what I've turned it into. So if you're looking for a way to make a little bit of extra spending money, making signs is the way to go, and they always sell really well. This is one of my favorite salvage wood signs that I've made this year. A piece of old pine, and the top of the sign was a piece that I found in the dump. I'm putting these two together, nailing them with a little bit of wood glue and filling in the crack with some wood filler. I let it completely dry. Now we're ready to do a painting technique and make this into a vintage rustic looking sign. Painted it with some black chalk paint, and I'm going to do a crackle paint technique using my school glue. You don't have to buy a crackle medium to create a crackle paint finish. You can do this all by yourself just using school glue. I have a full tutorial on this technique. If you haven't checked it out, I'll put the link down below in the description, and you can watch that video after you've watched this one. While the school glue is still wet, I'm painting on some white chalk paint right on top of that glue. You don't want to do a lot of strokes. You just want long, even strokes, and as it dries, the crackles appear. So I've taken a piece of wood and made it look old and vintage and crackle just with school glue. Now we're going to put some graphics on this. If you've been following along, you know I love my Mod Podge reverse graphics. The possibilities are endless with this technique. You don't need a Cricut. You don't need stencils. All you need is a printer and some Mod Podge, and you can create fantastic signs. I printed these graphics off on my LaserJet printer. Make sure to reverse the text if you do this technique, and let them sit for 24 hours after they completely dried. Dampening them with a little bit of water, rubbing off the paper. Make sure you're using really cheap computer paper. If you're using thicker paper, you've got more paper to rub off. So just buy the cheap stuff. Rubbed off all the paper. We're left with a beautiful sign that I now can seal up with some polyacrylic sealer. And I've taken some salvage wood that I found at the dump and an old piece of pine, and this is what I've created. Another one of my favorites from this year is just this collection of junk. I found this old scrap piece of wood in the dump. I had the old hinge, the chain. We're going to pull it all together and turn it into a farmhouse sign. Painted it with some of my black chalk paint. This piece of wood had a lot of texture and grain in it. It's really hard to do the Mod Podge reverse transfer method on that type of wood. So I filled in some of the grains with some wood filler, let it dry, and then painted some more black chalk paint on top of it. When you have too much grain and you go to rub off the paper, it's really hard to get in to all those little lines. So when you have more of a smooth piece of wood, it works better. Painted some white chalk paint on, and I put a border around the edge with some tape. We're ready now to turn this into a sign. I really aggressively sanded it, did the same transfer technique with my Mod Podge, let it sit for 24 hours, rubbed off all the paper. We're left with this beautiful flea market, antique, road sign, collectibles, vintage goods sign. Added all these bits and pieces, pulled the sign all together. I loved finishing it off with this chain. Beautiful rustic piece, all from scrap. Okay, another piece of salvage wood. This was a cupboard door that was discarded in the dump. We're going to turn it into another fantastic farmhouse theme sign. Painted it with some black chalk paint, and I'm just adding this pop of blue. It's going to be underneath. We're going to do a crackle technique, so the black and the blue will all peek through when we're finished. Now I'm doing a little bit of a twist on the crackle paint technique on this one. Again, school glue. I watered it down a little bit so it's not quite as thick. You just want to let it sit for about a minute. Grab a piece of wood, just a block of wood, dip it in the paint, and then you're going to just pull it across your sign. Let the paint go wherever it wants to go. Don't work it in too much. Just lightly rub that paint on the top. And I'm doing that over the entire sign. And then we're going to let it dry. After I've got that all scraped on, crackles are going to appear and it gives an old vintage rustic look. I have a full tutorial on this technique. I'll put a link down below in the description. After everything was completely dry, I took it outside. I really aggressively sanded it with an 80 grit sandpaper. And now we're going to weather this even more. I've got some water in my squirt bottle. I've propped my sign up against the wall with some towels around it, some cardboard at the back. And I've just got some of my black chalk paint and I've kind of watered it down a little bit. And then because the sign is also wet from the squirt bottle, it's just making it run a little bit. So I'm going to put it in all the little nooks and crannies and anywhere where that sign would have authentically aged, add that black paint. And then go back in again and squirt it with that squirt bottle of water. Let that paint just run everywhere. This is really messy, but the end result is so worth it. I'm just taking a little rag and I'm just patting off any of that extra water, seeing anywhere where it needs to have a little bit more of that aged look. But I'm actually loving the way that it's turned out. You can see all that raw wood where I sanded around the edges has now taken on that aged, weathered look. Added the graphics, same as my other signs, and this is what I created. One of my favorites of 2022. Another piece of pine that I brought home from the dump. It was brand new, but I'm gonna make it look old and vintage and chippy. I like just taking sometimes my utility knife around the edge and just chunking out little bits of wood. Just gives it more of that authentic look. And when you're making signs, you don't want it just to look like a piece of square wood. You want to give it character, and all of these techniques will give you that look. This one, I'm gonna layer on all kinds of different colors, and we're going to do the hairspray hack to create crackled paint. Now this can be a little bit of a tricky process. It takes a couple times to get it to work properly, but if you keep at it, it works fantastic. I've put on a couple layers of different colors of acrylic paint, and now I've got my extra hold hairspray really aggressively spraying on top of that. And I find the extra hold hairspray is the key to this working. And then you have to put acrylic paint on top. This will not work with any other paint. It has to be acrylic. Putting it all over that dry hairspray. And then I get my heat gun out, and as you're drying it, see all these crackles? That's what happens. It's a fantastic technique. Now I want to age this a little bit more. So I have my stencil brush and my squirt bottle with some water in it, and I'm just going to squirt the water around the outside edge of this sign. Take my stencil brush and I'm just going to rub that top layer of paint, that white paint, off to bring out those colors from underneath. And the water will just help that acrylic paint rub off. And as you can see how it gives that really rustic look, like it's an old piece of wood. Again, we're going back to taking that brand new piece of wood and making it look like it's an authentic old sign. I'm just doing that technique a little bit over the entire sign. So here, this was a brand new piece of pine. And this is what I did with my hairspray hack to create crackle vintage looking wood. Fantastic technique. Give it a try. I have a full tutorial. You can check that out down below and give this a try. Found this little fish at the thrift store, couldn't leave it there. I knew it would be turned into a sign for a fisherman. Had this live edge piece of wood, and I'm going to first paint it with some black homemade chalk paint, but I'm leaving the live edge. I want to keep the look of that raw wood around the side. And then once that black paint was dry, I took my candle wax and went all over the surface of that sign, and then painted on some green, some yellow, some more candle wax, and then I finished it off with some white homemade chalk paint. And then I heated everything up and took my scraper along the top, and anywhere where there was wax, you're going to bring that color up from underneath. Another fantastic technique to create vintage chippy looking wood. And again, Mod Podge reverse graphics. I printed off this Gone Fishing graphic and let it sit for 24 hours, rubbing off the paper, and we're going to be left with a great graphic on this sign. All of these graphics are available in my Etsy store if you're interested in any of them. I'll put the link down below and you can check it out. And we're going to glue the fish on with a little bit of E6000. This will look fantastic in a man cave or in a cottage or in a garage for your grandpa or your dad or your uncle that loves fishing. Another one of my favorites of the year. Whenever I'm at the thrift store, I'm always drawn to ornate old vintage frames. I might have a few too many in my stash, but can you ever have too many thrifted old ornate frames? I don't think so. After I was finished this sign, it actually turned out to be one of my favorites of this past year. I'm going to give the frame a bit of a chippy vintage feel. That seems to always be my go-to. I can never just leave anything a solid color. Always like to give it that aged look. So we're going to layer on some different paint colors. I'm loving this terracotta color, and the yellow turned out to be one of my favorite colors of 2022 to thrift and upcycle with. I've got a lot of projects that I use that color in. Now, this is completely dry. We're going to go back to that hairspray crackle hack again. The extra firm hairspray, I'm spraying it really liberally all over that whole frame. We're going to let it dry completely and then going on top of that with our white acrylic paint. This is one of those techniques that you never know what you're going to get. It's going to crackle in some spots and not crackle in others, but it just gives that authentic feel. Drying it with my heat gun, and as I'm doing that, my little crackles are going to appear. I find this is more of an authentic crackle than the school glue, so if you can get this one to work, I always like using this one the best. Now we're going to go in with a squirt bottle of water and my stencil brush and just distress this a little bit more, squirting water in any area where it would have naturally kind of worn down and just scrub off a couple layers of paint. Just keep rubbing it off until you get to the layer of paint that you want to peek through. Now for the inside of the frame, I had a scrap piece of wood that I cut to fit in the middle of the frame. I added this quote and I had this old rusty horseshoe that I'm going to glue on, and I love this. One of my favorites. Let me know what you think. Okay, this one, if you've got kids or grandkids and you want to do a DIY project with them, this is so much fun, and let them get messy and just put as many different colors as you want together to create fantastic bases for your signs. I've just got some saran wrap and some acrylic paint, and I'm just gonna glob and dab little bits of acrylic paint all over these wooden arrows. These were just salvaged pieces of wood that I cut into an arrow with my jigsaw. And once I have little dots all over, and I even took a little paintbrush and added little spots here and there, you're gonna lay that cling wrap right on top of that paint. And this is where the little ones can come in and they'll have a heyday with this. Let them just blend all these paint colors together, and just blend until you like the look of it, and just roll with it. So you can see how you can do all kinds of different color combinations, and it's gonna turn out fantastic. If you're a true crafter, I know you have all kinds of acrylic paint in your stash that you can do this project with. Pull it off and look at the base of this sign that we have that we can turn into a sign. Gonna do another one with some different colors. And a little tip, when you're done with this technique, peel away the saran wrap, don't throw it away, because you can take that paint that's on the saran wrap, press it onto a piece of paper, and you've got some beautiful paper for journaling. So here's my 2 salvaged wood arrows that I've done this painting technique on, and I turned them into some beach theme signs and a Hello Summer sign, sealed them up with some polyacrylic sealer. Love the way they turned out. Another one of my favorites from 2022. One of my best sellers from 2022 were my handmade cutting boards. One of my best sellers, I have a full tutorial on how to make these from start to finish. I'll put the link down below in the description. But this coffee house one was one of my favorites. I did the polyacrylic transfer method on this one. It's a little bit different than the Mod Podge, and you're using the polyacrylic. And this technique works really good on raw wood. I find when you do the Mod Podge on raw wood, you get that outline, that cloudy look. This eliminates it when you're using the polyacrylic to transfer. And my coffee house graphic, one of my favorites. And as you can see, the polyacrylic is a little bit more tricky to get the graphic to stay on, but I love the way that it looks. I think it just gives it that really kind of old worn look. One of my favorite signs that I created in 2022. One of the questions that I got asked the most down in my comments this past year was how to make large graphics. So recently I did a video on how to make big graphics. I have the full tutorial. I'll put the link down below in the description. But this was a sign that I made for this video, and once it was finished, I absolutely loved it. It was just a scrap piece of large barn board that I printed off these large graphics to say welcome, and then added it on a distressed paint finish underneath. And the trick with the bigger signs is to make sure you have all of your letters lined up. You don't have them crooked. Let me tell you, I've made a lot of signs in my time where I was rushed and I didn't take the time to tape them together and then put all the effort and time into making the sign, rubbed off the paper, and the bloody letters were crooked. So take your time when you're doing this technique. Watch this video on how to make the larger graphics, and the possibilities will be endless. Also, in this past year, my best sellers are my salvage wood signs and my shelf sitters using scrap wood. So if you can figure out this technique to do graphic transfer using Mod Podge, or if you can get the hang of a polyacrylic transfer, it's a great way to make a little bit of extra cash and put some money in your pocket. Another great tip when you want to get into making some salvage wood signs, ask friends and family. You'll be surprised what you'll get from people for free that you can turn into signs just like this. This DIY project is incredibly simple and so easy to do. All you need is a scrap piece of wood, a hammer, a chisel, a pair of pliers, some nails, and we're going to create that old rustic look, putting dents in it, weathered holes. And before moving on, I'm going to take it outside and give it a sanding with some 80 grit sandpaper just to soften it up around the edges. For staining, I found a great deal at our local hardware store, a $2 mist tint in a really beautiful color. I'm going to apply that stain on the wood and it looks fantastic. Now onto my stash of hardware. I keep a toolbox full of various handles and knobs and pulls that I can browse through when I want to find something that's going to be a perfect fit. I think these pulls will work perfectly. I also have a container filled with nails and screws that I know come in handy for these type of projects. I'm going to simply screw these 2 handles onto that piece of wood, and that's it. It's that easy. To finish it off and protect the wood, I'm sealing it with some polyacrylic sealer. This DIY is so versatile. They make a great addition to a kitchen for holding scrubbers or dish soap, or you can put them out on your dining room table or out in the patio. It's an effortless DIY that's both functional and has a lot of charm. Another DIY project that can help you earn extra cash is making breadboards. These have been incredibly popular for years, and the best part is they're super easy to make. I have a breadboard that I keep in my craft room, and it serves as a handy template. Now I have this scrap piece of wood that's full of character. It has nicks and dings, and it has that aged look already. I'm simply going to trace the shape of the cutting board onto it. I can get 2 cutting boards out of this one piece of wood, making it a really profitable DIY. I'm going to take it outside and I'm going to use my jigsaw and carefully cut out the shapes. Don't worry about feeling intimidated by jigsaw. They're actually quite easy to use. And if you don't have one already, I recommend checking out your local pawn shop for some great deals. You might be surprised at how affordable they can be. You can also find brand new ones really reasonably priced on Amazon. I'll provide that link down below in the description. Now that I've finished cutting them out, remember not to throw those leftover pieces. We can use them for another DIY project later on. I'll stash them away for now. Next, I'll take these breadboards outside and I'll use some 80 grit sandpaper to give them a smooth, polished finish. These boards already have so much character, so I don't want to sand them too much. I want to preserve that charming, worn out look. Most of these breadboards are primarily intended for decorative purposes. However, if you happen to be working with brand new wood and you know its type, I encourage you to do some research, find out how you can make these boards food grade and suitable for use in the kitchen. It's important to ensure that they meet the necessary standards and are safe for food preparation. To enhance the beauty of these boards, I've decided to use some leftover butcher block from a previous project. I'm applying this oil and it really highlights the gorgeous grain of this wood, and the end result is simply stunning. For the finishing touch, I'm going to drill a hole in the top, add some twine. One of the breadboards had a crack at the bottom, so I came up with a clever solution to prevent further cracking. I found an old rusty hinge in my stash along with some matching screws. I'm going to attach that hinge right between the crack and the wood. This addition should not only reinforce the board, but it'll also giving it a charming farmhouse feel. It's these unique touches that make each board one of a kind, and it also helps them sell better. Another best-selling DIY, and I love making these. And the best part is they're incredibly easy to assemble just using scrap wood. For this project, I used an old piece of wood that I believe was part of an old dresser, along with some leftover ends of 2x4s. With these materials, we're going to put everything together and create a fantastic riser. I've got enough material to make 2 risers, so I'm going to cut the 2x4s so they're all the same length. I'm going to sand down that scrap piece of wood that I've cut in half, and then we're going to put it all together. 2x4s will serve as an adorable feet on the riser. If you're feeling creative, you can also use spindles or even caster wheels to add a unique touch. Once assembled, these risers become one of my top selling items. To ensure the perfect placement, I'm going to center that 2x4 underneath the wood, and then I'm going to use my brad nailer and put it all together. I also added a little bit of wood glue also. To ensure the perfect placement, I'm going to center those 2x4s underneath the wood, adding a little bit of wood glue and then brad nailing it into place. Now I've mixed up some DIY stain. This is really popular right now, and it gives that rustic weathered look that complements that farmhouse or primitive style that everybody wants right now. I have a full tutorial on how to make my DIY stain. I'll put the link to that down below in the description. And to finish it off, I'm adding some dark antiquing wax. It's just going to fill up those little nooks and crannies and give it a really aged look that I'm trying to accomplish. And now I've completed 2 risers that I know are going to sell super fast. And if you want to know how to price your DIYs, I have a full tutorial on the formula that I use. I'll put the link to that down below in the description, and you can watch that after this video. I stumbled upon a discarded piece of wood in the burn pile which had already had a coat of red paint. Rather than letting it go to waste, I decided to repurpose it into a sign. To achieve an aged and rustic appearance, I applied my own homemade white chalk paint on top of the existing red. Afterwards, I took some coarse sandpaper, some 80 grit, and carefully sanded the edges, intentionally distressing them to give it a weathered and worn look. I have a knack for finding beauty in any scrap piece of wood. With just a sprinkle of creativity, I can easily transform it into something stunning, and it only takes a dash of imagination to turn ordinary into extraordinary. I took my paintbrush and applied acrylic paint to the wood by flinging, creating a stippled and splattered effect. I used some red and I used some blue, and then I set it aside and let it dry. As many of you know, I love using Mod Podge and reverse graphics in my projects. For this scrap piece, I'm going to be using my Mod Podge mat. I've printed my graphics on my LaserJet printer, making sure that the text is reversed before applying it to the sign. You can find this graphic in my Etsy store. I'll provide the link down below in the description, and it's a fantastic choice for celebrating the 4th of July. I resized this in Google Docs, allowing it for a larger design, more than a standard piece of paper. I've also created an easy tutorial on how to do this, and I'll put that down below in the description too, and it allows you to make bigger signs. You can try this technique with an inkjet printer too, so you're not restricted to a laser printer. I actually have a video demonstrating how it turns out when you use an inkjet printer. That'll be down in the description also. I opted for the cheapest computer paper available whenever I'm doing this technique because it means you don't have to rub off as much paper compared to using a thicker paper. After letting the sign dry for 24 hours, I gently rub off the graphics by lightly dampening a sponge with water. As I did this, the letters start to appear through the paper, and with a little bit of rubbing and a little bit of patience, the paper will all come off, leaving a beautiful graphic on your scrap piece of wood. I'm always asking my friends to save small bits and pieces of scrap wood for me because I can transform them into anything, charming shelf sitters, signs, or any other DIY projects. So spread the word that you're looking for scrap wood and you'll be surprised what you might get. To make my sign more vibrant, I used a simple method. I grabbed some of my acrylic paint and I painted over the graphic. This instantly adds a burst of color, making the sign look even better. If you have a laser printer with colored ink, you can skip this step. However, since my LaserJet only has black ink, I like to enhance my signs with acrylic paint. I brush on the paint and gently dab it with a tissue, and this is how it turned out. Just imagine how many people would have overlooked this ugly scrap piece of wood and left it in the burn pile, but wait until you see this amazing transformation it undergoes. The first step is to give it a distressed appearance using some candle wax. I took this pillar candle that I picked up at the dollar store and I rubbed it all over the piece of wood. Next, I applied some black chalk paint on top and I let it dry completely. Now it's time to add a touch of Vaseline. I want to achieve a really beautiful, distressed, and unique piece of wood, so I'm going to be using a few techniques. I'm applying Vaseline to the areas where the wood would have naturally aged, focusing around the edges, and then I'm going to add another layer of candle wax on top of that. This is going to prevent the paint from sticking, allowing us to scrape it off later and reveal those underlying colors. I have this really pretty light sage green acrylic paint, and I'm going to cover the entire piece, extending it right out to the edges, covering all of that candle wax and the Vaseline. After letting the first coat dry, I applied a second coat of paint and allowed it to dry completely. And then I added more candle wax. When I'm aiming for that distressed look, you can never go wrong with using plenty of candle wax. It creates that beautiful chipped age appearance. Just remember to use a white candle instead of a colored one, as the color might transfer onto your project.
I'm now applying a lighter yellow color on top of the previous layer, making sure to cover right to the edges. Before the paint dries, I brought out some pickling salt. You can use any type of salt. The more coarse, the more texture and chippy look you're going to get. I sprinkled that salt into that wet acrylic paint, and then I set it aside and I let it dry completely. You won't believe the amazing transformation of this scrap piece of wood that was destined for the burn pile. Once it was fully dry, I took a scraper and I started scraping off the salt, that candle wax, revealing that distressed effect created by the Vaseline. It has a really truly authentic appearance as I combine those 3 different techniques to achieve this result. Now I'm going to give the edges a finishing touch by sanding them with my 80 grit sandpaper using my palm sander. Finally, it's time to turn into a sign. I have this wonderful graphic that I designed that I'm going to be using for this project, which you can find in my Etsy store. It's perfect for adding a touch of charm to your garden or porch or even your kitchen. I've resized it slightly larger than a standard piece of paper using Google Docs, ensuring a proper fit. After printing it out, I applied some Mod Podge to the paper, making sure that I'd reverse the text, and I carefully placed that graphic, smoothing out any bubbles and wrinkles, set it aside, and let it dry for 24 hours. If you haven't tried this technique, you should definitely give it a go. It's incredibly easy, and the best part is you don't need a Cricut or stencils. With this technique, you're going to achieve a professional looking sign once you're done, and these sell fantastic. After letting it sit for 24 hours, I'm using a sponge, or you can also use a damp rag with a little bit of water to gently dampen the paper until the graphics begin to show through, and then you're going to rub off all of the paper. To add a vibrant touch to the sign, I'm using my acrylic paints again. I'll use green for the leaves and some pastel colors for the flowers. Once it's completely dry, I'm going to seal it up with a polyacrylic sealer, and I have created from an ugly scrap piece of wood that was destined for the burn pile into a stunning sign that's perfect to enhance your home decor. Go ahead and start exploring your wood pile or ask your friends to save some scraps for you. Give these sign making techniques a try and see what you can create. Let me know down in the comments which was your favorite sign in this video.
Remember that piece of wood that I cut off the bottom of that cabinet door? I'm going to upcycle it now. I did a chippy paint technique with some Vaseline to make it look really distressed around the edges, and I'm going to add this garage graphic using the same technique as I did on the teapot. Mod Podge, matte finish. We're going to put it all over the graphic, set it down, wait for the next day, rub off all the paper. We're left with a fantastic graphic, and as you can see, I just love this technique. It's so nice and crisp. I'm using my laser jet printer, and I'm just using regular computer paper. And if you're doing this technique yourself, make sure to remember to reverse your text or your letters will be backwards. So I've taken this scrap piece of cutoff from that cabinet door and turned it into a beautiful garage sign. Love the chippy paint on it. Would be a great gift to give to grandpa or dad to put up in their garage. Today's project, I am going to make a winter theme sign for my porch. These are just pieces of scrap pallet wood that I picked up for free from a pallet that I cut up. And then I made them into arrows. I just used my jigsaw to cut the arrow in the end of them. And then I needed a stake. I didn't have a stake, so I went to Home Depot and I picked this one up. This is a 3-foot stake. I think it was around $3 here in Canada. So we're gonna start painting and put this sign together. If you've been following along, you know that I love the look of chippy layered wood. So that's exactly what I'm gonna do on this sign. The first coat that I'm putting on is I'm gonna put some black chalk paint on all of these pieces of pallet and on that stake. So I'm gonna work away at getting everything all painted. Everything has a coat of the homemade black chalk paint.
If you've never made homemade chalk paint, I'll put the link down below in the description and you can watch that video because it's so easy and affordable to make. This is the graphics that I'm going to be using. I am going to color each palette arrow a different color to coordinate with these words. I think it's going to be really cute, lots of layered chippy paint. And the first one I'm going to do is skating rink. I am going to use my candle wax technique. This is a pillar candle from the dollar store. I use it a lot to create texture in my painting projects. And you just take it and you can be as aggressive or use as little as you like. I'm going to make these really chippy and rustic looking, so I'm using a lot of wax and just putting a lot of pressure on it. The first layer of paint I'm just going to use some acrylic paint that I have. This one's peacock blue. Because this is going to be skating rink, I kind of want to keep with the blue color of ice. And I'm just going to paint on that acrylic paint over that whole arrow, let it dry, and layer up another color after this one dries. That layer's all dry. Gonna take, again, some more candle wax, wipe it on, and then I have a little bit of the blue left over. I'm gonna add a little bit of white acrylic paint to that to lighten it up a little bit for the next layer. And layer that on. You don't have to get it everywhere. You wanna have places where you kind of hit and miss with the paint. That looks good. We're gonna let that dry and then do the last coat. Now this coat's all dry. I'm gonna put an aggressive amount of that candle wax all over it. And then I'm gonna put on a top coat, which will be our last coat of my white homemade chalk paint. And I'm not gonna put it everywhere. I'm gonna kind of leave around the sides a little bit blue. And then when that's all dry, we're gonna scrape off that candle wax and this arrow will be done. The white is all dry. The trick to have a fantastic candle wax chippy layered look is when you're all finished, warm it up with your heat gun or your hair dryer to kind of melt that wax. And then I like to take a scraper. This is a razor scraper. You can use an ordinary scraper and scrape off all of that wax that's melted and you'll be left with a real layered chippy look. So I'm gonna work away at that. And there's the effect that you get. Now this isn't finished. When I have all my boards done, I'm gonna take them out to my shed and sand them with my sander around the edges also. But it's got some real nice chippy look to it already. Okay, we're gonna go on to our next sign. The next one we're going to do is Ski Lodge, and I think I wanna do a red background for this one. We're gonna apply the candle wax on top of the black, then we're gonna layer red, and then we're gonna layer white. Next one that we're going to do, Snowshoe Trail, and I think I'm going to use some green for the background on this one. Same process, wax, paint, wax, paint. And the last one, hot chocolate. And I am going to use some of my brown acrylic paint. And again, paint, wax, paint, wax. And we'll have another board ready. All 4 pieces are completely done. I took them out to my shed and I gave them a real good sanding with some 80 grit sandpaper with my palm sander, and they turned out fantastic. This technique works so good for taking a new piece of wood and making it look old and vintage and chippy, and it just takes your projects up a notch. Now we're ready to put our signs together. Like I said before, this is the graphic that I'm going to use. You can grab it in my Etsy store if you want to use it. Make sure you use the code SAVE50. You'll get 50% off all of the graphics out of my whole store, and you can make some of these signs for yourself. I'm going to use my Mod Podge reverse graphic transfer method. This is printed on plain computer paper on my laser jet, and I'm going to be using my Mod Podge mat. I've got them all cut to size. Make sure if you want to try this technique, you reverse your text. If you're buying them out of my Etsy store, one of the files is already reversed, so you don't need to worry about that. Now we're going to put the Mod Podge on, set them on the boards, and let them sit until tomorrow. I want to add some snowflakes as embellishments when it's all finished. I picked these up at the dollar store over the holidays. I'm going to give them a coat of white chalk paint, and then I think I might put some little bit of glitter on top afterwards. I got my snowflakes all painted. I dabbed on a little bit of a brown color too, just so they looked a little bit rustic and not that stark white. And now I'm going to take my Mod Podge, and I'm just going to put a coat of Mod Podge on the top and then sprinkle on some glitter. Snowflakes are done. That little touch of the glitter finished them off perfectly. I'm going to set these aside, and then when I finish the signs, I'm going to add them onto them. It has been 24 hours. These are all nice and dry. I have a little dish of water with a little tiny rag, and I'm just going to wet that paper just till the graphics start to show through. You don't want to put on too much water. That's perfect. And then you just start rubbing away. So it's going to take me a little bit to get through these 4 signs. I kind of find this whole process kind of relaxing. So I'm just going to sit here and rub all the paper off, and I'll be back when they're all finished. All done. And I think myself, just taking that extra little time to do a painting technique like the candle wax just takes your signs to the next level, gives them a little bit of personality and character. We are now ready to seal it up with some polyacrylic sealer, satin based. Make sure if you're going to put this sign outside that you buy an outdoor formula so it'll hold up in the extreme weather. I'm just going to coat all 4 of these signs, and then the last step of pulling it all together. I put my little snowflakes on with some hot glue, and they'll stay put. I use the Gorilla hot glue. It works really well. Now I'm going to measure, find the center point, and then drill a hole so I have a hole to secure the signs onto the post. I've got them all secured on. I used screws, and I put a little bit of wood glue underneath them to hold it really in place well. I had this lantern that I picked up a long time ago at a thrift store. I am going to hang it from the bottom of my sign, and I've got a little hook that I'm just going to screw down at the very bottom right here. I wanted to make a topper for my sign, and I had this scarf that I picked up before Christmas at a thrift store. It was like 50 cents, and it's got a couple holes in it. I knew I wanted just to use it for crafting. So I'm just gonna tie it in a bow, add some
greenery. I have all kinds of little scrap pieces of greenery that's kind of wintry, not so much Christmas looking. And I'm gonna add it to the top of the scarf bow and then add it to the top of my sign. I think it's gonna finish it off perfect. I love the way this turned out. That little bit of greenery on the top, and then I draped that thrift store scarf along the side. I found a pair of old vintage skate guards that I added on the side, and my lantern finished it off completely. Taking that little bit of extra time and doing the candle wax method to distress your wood just makes your signs look so much more expensive and so much better. So if you're interested in making one of these signs, head to my Etsy store, grab the graphics, and try out these techniques. Never toss away your scrap wood. Let me share a fantastic way to transform these leftover 2x4 pieces into quick cash. If you need some extra money, reach out to your friends or head over to Home Depot and inquire about their scrap wood bin. Bring it home, give this technique a go, and I guarantee you're going to make some easy, straightforward additional cash with just a few supplies. A thoughtful friend gave me these 4 pieces of 2x4, knowing I could create something beautiful out of them. To ensure that they're all the same size, I'm going to use my chop saw and cut these 4 pieces in half, resulting in a total of 8 equal-sized pieces. I actually found the chop saw I'm using at a local pawn shop, and the price was really affordable. So if you're looking for budget-friendly tools, I highly recommend checking out your nearby pawn shop. We'll be crafting some charming signs or shelf sitters using some scrap wood, and I personally like to give them a touch of rustic flair. I find these sell the best for me. However, feel free to add your own spin and adapt the technique to match your taste and style. I've noticed that the slightly rustic look sells best for me. Here's what I do. I start by applying a base coat of my homemade black chalk paint and allow it to dry completely. Next, I layer on a coat of my homemade white chalk paint, creating a beautiful contrast. Today I'm feeling whimsical, so I'm going to explore with some various colors from my acrylic paint stash and paint these blocks. This method is fantastic for using up those leftover scraps of acrylic paint, so you don't have to go out and buy a bunch of new paint for this project. It's amazing how much paint we actually accumulate over time. Today I'm using all the tail ends of my acrylic paint bottles, and they work wonderfully for this project. These scrap pieces of wood can be transformed into really profitable crafts for the upcoming fall, Halloween, Christmas seasons. With a simple and straightforward approach, you can create beautiful signs, shelf sitters, or other decorative items that are in high demand. And these handmade creations can be sold at craft fairs, listed on Facebook Marketplace, or even showcased on Etsy, providing you an opportunity to earn extra cash really easy. If you can get the wood for free and already have the supplies you need, you're all set to make a really good profit. It's an easy way to earn more money without much hassle, making your craft projects even more financially rewarding. I've put 2 coats of that acrylic paint on each one of these blocks. I'm going to speed it along with my heat gun. Once they're fully dry, we'll take our palm sander and use the 80 grit sandpaper to distress the edges. As I mentioned earlier, the rustic blocks and shelf setters tend to sell well for me. You can choose to skip this if you prefer, but I personally love this look and my customers are always attracted to it. It's remarkable how you can transform a scrap piece of 2x4 into a really beautiful block to start our project.
Now, if you've been following along, you've seen me use the Mod Podge transfer method, which is fantastic and incredibly budget friendly for crafting items to sell. I print these designs on my laser printer using regular computer paper and adjust the size to fit each block. To ensure the text comes out correctly, I reverse them in Google Docs. All of these quotes are available in my Etsy store. If you'd like to check them out, I'll put the link down below in the description. They're really easy to use, and I'm sure you're going to find them convenient for your own projects. And if you get them out of my Etsy store, they're already reversed. By the graphic, I'm using my Mod Podge mat and applying a light coat on top of that graphic. I carefully center it on the blocks, ensuring that there's no bubbles and wrinkles, and then firmly press them down. Then I'll set these aside. We're going to let them dry completely for 24 hours. As you can see, the possibilities are endless when it comes to designing or purchasing graphics for different seasons and turning them into shelf sitters for fantastic products to sell. And you're not limited to just using 2x4s. This process works with any type of scrap wood. You can create signs, boxes, wall hangings, and so many more. It's now been 24 hours and I have a little dish of water and a little rag, and I'm just dampening that paper until you can just start to see the graphics show through. And then I'm just using my fingers and I'm rubbing off that paper. And as we're doing that, you can see the graphic stays on our blocks. A little bit of practice, but with some patience, you can get these graphics to turn out fantastic on all of your DIY projects. After removing all the paper, it's important to seal the shelf sitters with some polyacrylic sealer, or you can even use Mod Podge as a top coat. Once sealed, your shelf sitters are ready to be listed for sale. I'm thrilled with how adorable these creations have turned out, all made from scrap wood and easy to bring in some cash. If you've tried this technique before, I'd love to hear about your experience in the comments below. Thanks for watching, have a fantastic day, and stay tuned for the next video. And if you enjoyed this tutorial, I'm confident you're going to love either of these next two videos as well. So let's start making those signs and earning some extra money. To properly prepare the board for painting, I begin by creating a surface that the paint's going to easily adhere to. I sanded the board with 80 grit sandpaper to make it easier for the paint to stick, and then I used a hammer to create some dents and notches to make it look more old-fashioned. Once I finished that, I painted it with one coat of my homemade black chalk paint. We are now ready to mix together our salt wash paint. I'm using half a cup of latex paint, half a tablespoon of plaster of Paris, and 1 tablespoon of pickling salt. You can double the recipe if you need more. And you can use any type of salt. The more coarse, the more chippy effect you're going to have. Now we want to thoroughly mix the ingredients together until there's no lumps or clumps in the mixture. The key to this technique is in the application method. Rather than brushing the paint on, gently dab that paintbrush up and down to achieve the desired texture. It's crucial to avoid using paint strokes, as this can mix that paint in with that salt and it's going to ruin that salt wash effect. Instead, gently dab that paintbrush up and down to create the desired texture. Be sure to fully saturate that paintbrush with paint and apply it generously over the entire board. It's essential to allow the first coat to dry completely before proceeding to the next step. Once the salt wash paint has dried, you can put it out in the sun or leave it for a few hours or even overnight. It's time to apply another coat in a contrasting color. This technique allows for endless possibilities, as you can layer multiple colors and each board will have a unique and distinct appearance. It's always exciting to see the final outcome, as you never quite know what you're going to get. If you're interested, I have a booklet available in my Etsy store with all of my favorite painting recipes. You can easily download and print them out on your computer at home, and it's a handy reference to have all the recipes in one place when you're ready to start crafting. I'll put that link down below in the description and you can check it out if you're interested. I'm now going to set this aside and let it dry completely, and you can see the texture that we're creating already with that salt that's incorporated into this paint recipe. I tend to get carried away with this technique and enjoy seeing different colors peeking through. You don't have to use as many colors if you don't want to, but personally, I love layering as many colors as possible to achieve a beautiful chippy texture. Of course, you can just use one or two colors if that's your preference. The end result is what matters, and this technique always delivers stunning and unique results. All my colors are completely dry, and now I'm brushing on some homemade white chalk paint to finish the process. While we wait for this to dry, let me tell you all about our new Our Upcycled Life Graphic Club.
I'm so excited to announce our Upcycled Life Graphic Club. I love designing graphics for all of my DIY projects, and I've created this program so you can enjoy all of them also at an amazing savings. As a member, when you sign up on Patreon, you're going to receive at least 20 graphics a month in 2 newsletters. One on the 15th and one on the 30th, and sometimes you're going to get even more. I'm always adding into my Etsy store. At the regular price of my graphics in my Etsy store, they're $2.50. So by signing up for this graphic club, you're going to be paying 35 cents a design. And these graphics are going to be an assortment of motivational quotes, pictures, ephemera, and so much more. Also, graphics that are already listed in my shop, you're going to get a discount code for 50% off to purchase any of those. So you're not going to have to go through my shop and try to find my newest creations. You're going to automatically get them in your inbox. And if you're interested in joining, you can click the link below down in the description box to visit my Patreon page. The very first newsletter, when you sign up, you're going to get 5 graphics for free. So if you want to craft with fantastic, fun graphics at an amazing discount price, I would love to have you join our Upcycled Life Graphic Club.
Now that it's completely dry, let's get back to work. Using a scraper, we're going to scrape away all the areas where we applied salt. This will reveal the underlying colors of paint, creating a beautiful effect as we scrape away that top layer. You're going to see all the colors that we use, the red, the black, the yellow, the turquoise, along with that natural wood underneath. This process is incredibly satisfying and rewarding as we uncover that beautiful wood and texture and chippy finish underneath. We're going to sand the board now to smooth it out, and I'm using my palm sander with an 80 grit sandpaper to go over the entire surface. It can get pretty dusty, so make sure you do it outside in a well-ventilated area and wear a mask for safety. As you can see, we've easily created a vintage chippy looking piece of wood using salt wash paint, and now it's time to turn it into a sign. This is my go-to transfer method using Mod Podge for reverse graphics, and I'm excited to use all 3 of these coffee graphics on this sign. You can find all of these graphics in my Etsy store. I'll leave the link down below in the description. I resized my graphics in my Word program to fit the sign, and now we're using a light coat of Mod Podge matte on each graphic. If you're not familiar with how to resize graphics, I have a helpful tutorial linked in the description below. I love this technique because it doesn't require any vinyl or stencils or expensive materials. All you need is a printer, either a laser jet or an inkjet, and some computer paper, Mod Podge, and a little bit of patience to create stunning signs with this method. After 24 hours, I'm dampening the graphic with a sponge and water until it becomes visible and you can see the words or the graphic underneath. Then I'm going to start rubbing off the paper. This technique requires some practice and patience, so don't get discouraged if you're new to it. Take your time, work in small sections, and use only a little bit of water and rub it until all of the paper is removed. If you can master this technique, the possibilities are endless. It's really satisfying to take a piece of scrap wood that was just laying around and probably going to be burnt in a wood pile and turn it into something beautiful with some paints and graphics. This technique is also a great way to make some extra money by selling your DIY projects, so don't be afraid to get creative and give this a try if you haven't. And to finish it off, I sealed it up with some polyacrylic sealer. And here's the final product, and I couldn't be happier with how it turned out. The salt wash paint chippy texture adds a unique charm to the sign, which complements the coffee graphics perfectly. And to be honest, I'm not sure if I can part with it. It may just have to find a spot in my own home. I'm going to show you the 3 techniques on this palette wood that I've already painted with some black chalk paint. The first technique that I'm going to show you is using pickling salt and spray paint. Now, for any of these techniques, you don't have to use pickling salt. You can use any type of salt. Epsom salt, table salt, bath salt, any will work. I just find the coarse pickling salt gives the best chipping effect. I've sprinkled the pickling salt all around the outside of the piece of palette wood, and then I'm taking my spray paint and I'm just spraying over top of the salt. As you can see in the beginning, I had the spray paint held too close to the salt, and when I sprayed it, it blew the salt away. You want to make sure you're having your spray paint held far enough away from the wood that you don't disperse the salt. You're going to set it aside, let it dry completely, and then once it's dry, I just like to take a paintbrush and just brush away all of that salt. As you can see, when you brush away that salt, we're left with a really chippy layered look. That black is peeking through, and all those grains from the salt have given different texture to that paint underneath. I really love this method, and it's really quick and easy to do. Great base for signs. Then I like to take my palm sander with my 80 grit sandpaper and just sand over the entire board. All 3 of these techniques can also be used on furniture, and they create an amazing antique looking piece of home decor on a budget. This next technique is crazy easy. Paint your board with any type of paint you want. You can use latex, you can use chalk paint, you can use up acrylic paint, and paint your whole board. Before it dries, pick up your salt and just sprinkle your salt into that wet paint. That's it. That's how easy it is. And you can create a fantastic chippy look with this sprinkling of salt on top of the wood. We're going to set it aside and let it dry completely. That's completely dried now, and now we want to sand off the salt. Make sure you're doing this in an area where it doesn't matter if you make a mess, because it can get really messy. And you just sand until all the salt is gone. I'm using an 80 grit sandpaper, and as you can see, anywhere that there was salt, it has soaked through to that base color, and it's leaving that chippy effect. Now I've got it all sanded, and you can see how beautiful this looks. You can see the black that showed through where the salt was, and with it sanded around the edges, it looks fantastic. Now I'm going to show you my favorite technique. This one takes a little bit more work, but it's worth it, and you can add 2 or more colors and have that layered chippy look. I'm using up some of my acrylic paint. I'm just going to put enough acrylic paint in there to do 1 coat on the board, and I'm also going to use some of this yellow. I think they're going to look really fantastic together. And then you just pour in your salt. There's not really any measurement. You just pour it until all the paint and the salt has incorporated together, and the more you put in, the more chippy you're going to get. The less you put in, the less of effect you're going to get. And you just stir it together. And you can just imagine all the color combinations that you can mix together using this technique. It's also a great way to use up your little bits of paint. I'm going to use this turquoise color first, and you just want to spread it out on the board. The thing with this technique is you don't want to actually use brush strokes. You want to dab up and down. If you use the brush strokes, you're going to brush that salt back and forth, and the paint's going to get underneath it, and you're not going to get that effect. So just dab it up and down until you cover the whole board. This is kind of a simplified version of my salt wash paint, which I absolutely love. I have a full tutorial on how to create that recipe. I'll put a link down below in the description, but this is just a quick and easy way to get a similar result. We've got the first coat dabbed on. We're going to set it aside and let it dry thoroughly. The first coat is completely dry, and this is crucial. You have to make sure it's completely dry before you put on the next coat. We're going to use the yellow acrylic paint with the salt mixed in it, and the same process, just dab it up and down. I'm only going to be using the two colors today, the turquoise and the yellow, but you can definitely layer on all kinds of different colors and the effect is amazing. Okay, we've got the last layer on. Now we have to set it aside and let it completely dry. This is a crucial step, is letting these dry in between each coat. If not, when you go to sand it, you are going to have a mucky mess. So we want it nice and dry. I'm going to go over this with my 80 grit sandpaper. Make sure you're sanding in an area where it doesn't matter if you make a mess, because this is really messy as you're sanding off all of the salt. And it's all finished, and isn't this fantastic? It's so chippy and layered, and I think it actually looks authentic, like an old piece of weathered wood. So there's 3 different ways that you can use salt to create texture, chippy, layered looking wood. So make sure you try out these techniques for yourself, and I hope it was helpful. Today I'm going to show you how you can make a sign without any stencils or Cricut or even Mod Podge. You know I love my Mod Podge reverse graphic transfer method to make signs, but this one is super simple and super easy. I got some carbon paper off of Amazon, and it came with a whole bunch of sheets of black and white transfer paper and these little burnishing tools. And I also picked up some paint pens that I'm going to try. Now, I haven't tried any of this, so this is going to all kind of be just a first time process. I think it's going to be pretty easy, and if it is, it's a great way for you to make signs really affordable. The first thing I did was I picked what I wanted to put on my sign. This is just a piece of old driftwood that I had, and I printed off welcome, and I sized it to fit my project. And we are going to use a piece of the carbon paper. I'm going to use a piece of the black to transfer the lettering onto the piece of wood. I've cut the carbon paper to the size that I want it on the wood. Now I don't want it to move around very much, so I've got a little bit of packing tape, and I'm just going to kind of just make sure it stays in one spot and tape it onto that so it doesn't move around. And then I've got my graphic, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put it exactly where I want it, and then I'm going to tape it on top. I'm going to move it down a little bit, and then I'm going to tape it right on top of that carbon paper so it doesn't move around. And we're ready to start tracing the letters onto the wood. Now you can use a toothpick or something that's got a sharp end on it, but you want to be able to burnish that carbon paper right onto the wood, so when you go to paint it afterwards, you can see where you need to paint. And you just want to take your time. You don't want to go outside the lines, so you can have a nice crisp graphic when you're finished. So I'm just going to work away at this. Okay, I have it all traced, and you can take this up really carefully and you can have a look and see if you've missed any spots. And it's transferred really well. So now I can see, I don't know if you can see very well, but now you can see where you need to paint all the letters. Now I'm going to paint with one of these paint pens. I love these. You can get them in different tips and colors. And I'll put a link below down in the description for these too, because they're really great to craft with. So now I'm just going to use my paint pen and just paint all around those lines that I traced and fill it all in. And I don't care if it's completely perfect, because this is going to be a really rustic sign. So just take your time if you're using these and just trace it out first, and then we'll fill it all in with the paint pen afterwards. I have it all traced out now, and we're ready to fill it in with a paint pen. And
Now this is on raw wood, so it's a little bit harder to see what you've traced out. If you were doing this on a white painted surface and then doing the carbon transfer, it would show out a lot more, and you would be able to see the lines when you're tracing. But this worked out really well. I've got it completely done, and it takes a little bit to dry, the paint pen to dry. Not very long though, it's quick drying, so I'm going to set it aside, and when it's dry, I'm going to make it nice and rustic and finish off this sign. I've got a sanding block, and I'm just going to sand right over those letters that I painted so it looks really weathered and old looking and not perfect. And I'm going to seal it up with some polyacrylic water-based sealer. Just put a good coat over the whole piece. And if you want to make a sign like this and keep it outside, then I would recommend using a outdoor polyacrylic sealer. And now I'm just going to drill a couple holes in the top to hang some jute string through. I've had these in my stash for a long time. They're little bells. I think they might have came on a dollar store sign maybe, and I took them off and set them aside. And I'm going to put them along the bottom of the sign, and I think it'll finish it off perfect. I'm just finishing this up, and I remembered I had some beads left over from a DIY I did on how to paint beads quickly. Fantastic tutorial. If you haven't seen it, you need to go back and check it out. I'll put a link down below in my description for it. But I thought these colored beads kind of fit that vibe really well for the sign. So I'm going to add them onto this piece of hanging jute. So you can see how easy it is to create signs using this transfer carbon paper. And if you are kind of intimidated by all the rest of the sign making processes, this one's for you. I'll put a link down below in the description so you can grab some carbon paper if you don't have any. And the kit with the burnished tools is fantastic to use. And the paint pens are so easy to be more precise when you're tracing all of those letters in. I'm going to make a farmhouse theme sign just on this scrap piece of wood. The first thing that I'm going to do is paint it with some black chalk paint, and that's going to be the base of my sign. And it's going to take 2 coats, and I'm doing the black underneath because that's what you want to show through when you do the crackle. Whatever color you use as your base is what will show through on the crackles underneath your white paint. I'll put a link down below in the description for my favorite chalk paint recipe. Now the magic potion to this technique is school glue. You don't need to use Elmer's. You can use any type of school glue. Anything from the dollar store will work. And you just want to pour a liberal amount over your whole project. I'm getting to the bottom of this one, so I'm just kind of pouring it right onto the sign. And how thick you put it on will determine how big your crackles are. If you put a thin coat, you'll have thin crackles. A thick coat, you will have really thick crackles. Once you have all your glue down, you're just going to spread it out over your whole surface. And then once it's sat for about a minute, you want to let it just get a little bit tacky. You're going to get whatever color top coat you want. I'm using my white chalk paint. And the trick to this technique working the best is to do long strokes, and you don't want to work with it too much. I just try to go back and forth maybe 3 times at the most, and then move on to the next section. If you work the paint into the glue too much, you won't have any crackling. So what's going to happen as that glue dries, that crackle is going to form, and you're going to start to see that black paint underneath show through and giving that crackling effect.
I just love this technique because it can take a project or a brand new piece of wood and make it look old and antique and vintage in a couple easy steps. Now, after you finish that coat, you don't want to go back and put another coat on because that will affect the crackle. We're just going to leave it now and let it dry and work its magic. And you can see as it's starting to dry, all the little crackles are starting to show through and creating this fabulous texture on this wood. I love using this technique for the base of my farmhouse signs. And sometimes I'll even layer 2 or 3 different colors to get them to peek through with the crackle. It's fun. You just kind of fool around with it, see how it works for you, and then use it on some of your projects. And you don't have to use chalk paint for this technique. You can use latex or acrylic. It all works and it'll all crackle beautifully. Okay, everything is completely dried and I'm going to turn this into a fabulous farmhouse sign. This is one of my favorite graphics. I'm going to use my Mod Podge mat. If you've been following along, you know this is one of my favorite techniques to transfer graphics onto my signs. You just put a light coat over all of the graphics, make sure you reverse your text, print it off on regular computer paper, let it sit overnight. You're going to dampen the paper and then rub off all the paper and the graphics are left on your sign. I'll put a link down below in the description for a full tutorial that goes into much more depth to do this technique. All finished, and I love the crackle background on this sign. This graphic is available in my Etsy store if you want to grab it and try out this project for yourself. Make sure you use the code SAVE50 because you'll get 50% off all the graphics in my Etsy store. They're already reversed, so you can use them right away for your project and download them right to your computer and print at home. I'm going to work on this one first, and I'm going to put some candle wax all around the edges. This will leave a really cool distressed look. Anywhere that there's wax, the paint won't adhere to it, so the black will be exposed through the top coat. So I'm being really aggressive, just kind of putting it wherever. And this is just a pillar candle that I picked up at the dollar store. Works perfect. Now I'm going to put a coat of just some brown. This is just an acrylic paint that I had. I want to create a couple different layers. So I'm just going to paint this on. I know I've mentioned in my other videos, I love these Wooster brushes. This one's been very well loved, but they work fantastic for getting into little corners and stuff. So I'll put a link down in my description. If you've never used this brush, you need to grab one to put in your crafting supply stash. This is all dry, so I'm going to put some more candle wax here and there around the edges. Just kind of aggressively push it right in so you have the wax kind of stick to it. I'm going to put some right down the center here. And then I'm going to put on a coat of my white chalk paint over the entire sign, slopping it on. If you want that vintage look, you don't want it to look perfect. You just kind of want it slapped on, pieces where you kind of didn't get the paint and you missed it. And then I'm going to, once I get this all done, I have some pickling salt. And this is a little bit different than my salt paint recipe. This is just kind of a little trick I learned to get a little bit more texture in your paint. You're just going to take your pickling salt. I just buy the stuff from the grocery store. It's quite coarse. You can use any kind of salt. The coarseness of it will determine the texture that you have in your paint. And I'm just going to sprinkle it onto that wet paint. And what it's going to do is it's going to melt a little bit into that paint. And when you sand it down, it's going to show some of those other colors underneath. Really simple way to create a really aged looking wood. This one's dry. We're going to give it a real good sanding, and it'll have a real distressed look when it's all finished. And this one's all ready for the graphics. And see how it kind of gives it a real pebbled look?
I just love that. It gives it a real kind of aged look, and it's going to be a fantastic background for the graphic that I picked out. So let's get started with the graphic. Okay, we're ready to do the graphics. This is one of my favorite farmhouse graphics that I've made. This is what it looks like, and I've put it into my Word program, reversed it, and now we're ready to Mod Podge it onto the wooden sign. This is just done on regular computer paper. I have a full tutorial on how to do my graphics. I'll put a link right up above here and down below in the description that'll take you through a more in-depth step-by-step to learn how to do it. It's really simple. You can use, I always use my laser jet printer, but it will work on an inkjet printer. So I also have a video comparing the inkjet and the laser jet that I'll have down in the description, and you can check that out too. And this graphic is also available in my Etsy store. You're going to get 3 files. You're going to get a JPEG, a PNG, and the file already reversed. So you don't have to fiddle around and figure out how to reverse your graphics, because this will already be done for you. So we're just going to use Mod Podge Mat and get to work and put it on my board. Okay, they're all glued on. I've pressed out any bubbles and wrinkles, and now I'm going to set it aside, let it sit overnight and dry really well, and then we'll be ready to rub the paper off. Now, the one thing that I haven't mentioned about my signs, I always like to do a white top coat before I put my graphics on. If you're using a darker color, your graphics are not going to show that well, and I find with the Mod Podge on a darker color, you'll get the outline of where the Mod Podge is. With the white, it all blends in nice, so that seems to be what I use for my top coat on most of my stuff. Now it's dried overnight, 24 hours. I'm just taking a damp rag and I'm just dampening it so you can just start to see the graphics come through and rubbing off the paper. It takes a little bit of practice, but once you get the hang of it, the possibilities are endless of what you can do with this technique. And we're now ready to put the top coat on and finish it off. And this one is all done. I love the effect that the salt makes on this. It just kind of gives it a little pebbly, kind of aged vintage look and makes it look more authentic, more of a farmhouse style. And I'm loving this graphic. And it's so easy to create this effect. Just sprinkle a little bit of coarse salt into your paint, and as it dries, it melts into the paint and gives this fabulous texture. Let me know down in the comments what you think about it. Now I'm going to take my candle wax. There's a lot of grain and texture in this, so I think the candle wax is going to look really cool, just kind of rubbed over the whole surface on, and it'll pick up on all those high edges when I put the paint on. So I'm just going to go over the entire sign. You got to press down quite hard to get the wax to come off the candle, and go back over it one more time on this side, and then we're ready to put another layer of paint. I'm going to put probably 2 or 3 layers on this one because I want this to look really old and vintage. And don't be afraid to try 2 or 3 different painting techniques on a project. You don't have to be stuck with just doing one technique. Okay, and I've had this blue chalk paint around for a long time. I'm just going to slap it on, let some of the black still show through. Doesn't have to be perfect. And this will be just one of the bottom layer colors that will peek out just a little bit. When you see the old vintage signs, you can see all the different colors that they've used on them over the years and painted over top. And sometimes the colors don't make any sense, but when they're all blended in together, they look fantastic. Okay, so we're just gonna let this dry. Okay, and this is all dry. Gonna take some more candle wax. Again, back and forth. I got some tail end of some yellow acrylic paint that I'm gonna put on next just to use up. And you can mix and match paint colors. You don't have to use all chalk paint. I sometimes will mix latex and then I'll mix some acrylic with these techniques. It's just kind of just fun, and you just kind of see what works, and you know what, if it doesn't work, you paint over it and you put another layer on. So So I just want a little bit of the yellow kind of peeking through. I didn't have very much left out of my little bottle of acrylic paint, just enough to just have maybe that yellow peek through just a little bit here and there. Okay, and then I'm gonna let that dry. Okay, I am feeling really creative today. So next layer, gonna put on, again, aggressively put on some candle wax. Press down really hard, get that wax transferring onto that wood and all those little nooks and crannies around the edge. And then I'm gonna throw on some red. Again, just hit and miss. You don't want to paint over everything, just kind of have it peeking through. Doesn't matter if you have it kind of globbed in some spaces and not in other. I love the colors of this already. Okay, and we're gonna let this dry. A little bit of a process to do all the different layers, but it's gonna be so worth it when it's finished.
Okay, now this is completely dried. I'm taking my palm sander. I have an 80 grit sandpaper on it. It's quite coarse, and I'm just really aggressively giving it a really good sanding just to kind of take down any high spots that I might have and get some of that wood showing through on the edges, and then we'll be ready to put on our top coat.
Okay, now I have to do one more coat, and I'm going to do the crackle paint technique with the Elmer's school glue, or any kind of school glue will work. So what you're going to do is you're going to just brush this lightly over this whole entire surface, and then I'm going to put a coat of my white chalk paint on top of it, and as the glue dries, it crackles that white paint on the top, and it'll show all these colors through, and it'll be really fantastic looking. Okay, so let's get at it. Okay, now the thicker that you put the glue on, the thicker the crackles, the thinner the crackles. So this is just kind of something you can just kind of play around with and see what you like. I just slop it on, and then I'm gonna take my paintbrush and spread it around. You don't want to have it too thick in some places and thin in the other. You kind of want to get an even pour of your glue and just put it all over the entire piece. And then you're going to let it sit for about a minute and just kind of get a little bit tacky. And then we're going to put on some white chalk paint. Okay, this has sat for about a minute. I've got some white chalk paint, and I am just going to slop it on. You don't want to go back and forth this way and then this way. You want to keep going in one direction, and then that way your crackle is going to work the best. So I'm just doing long strokes. You don't want to work in too much back and forth. I have a full tutorial actually on how to do this with more in-depth steps. I'll put a link down in the description, and you can check that out if you want. Almost there. And I'm missing a few spots too. You don't have to have it covered everywhere because you want that color kind of showing through. Globby, messy, always looks the best. Okay, I think that's all I want on there. Now you just sit and watch the crackles come. This is all completely dry, and you can see the crackling. See that? Because I put such a thin layer on, not a thick layer of the glue, the crackles are quite small, and I love the way that it turned out. See this right here kind of crackled. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to take it outside, and I'm going to give it a really good sanding. Okay, I've printed my graphics all out. This is a graphic that I'm going to use on this one. I actually was inspired by a sign that I saw on Pinterest, and I designed this graphic. It's also available in my Etsy store. Make sure if you want to buy any of my graphics, you use the code SAVE50 and you'll get 50% off every graphic in my store, and you can pick them up and you can make your own projects right at home. But I love this one, and I think it's going to look fantastic on this great big circle. So I'm going to get started using my Mod Podge mat and get this glued down. Okay, I'm getting there on this sign, but it's causing me some grief. I'm just taking it really slow. This board is a piece of plywood. It has lots of grooves in it, and it's really hard to rub the paper off in between those little grooves. So I'm just really taking my time, just kind of dampening the end of my finger and just kind of rubbing the paper off slowly. And I might be here for a bit, but I think the end result is going to be fantastic. So make sure you stick to the end to see how this turns out, guys. Okay, note to self, don't use wood when you're doing this technique that has lots of grooves and pits, because it's a bugger to get the paper all off it. I made an iced coffee. I'm sitting in my shed and I'm just slowly working away on each letter. This has taken me way longer than I thought it was going to, but it's going to be worth it when it's done. And I think kind of this texture in it has kind of given it a lot of character anyways. So almost there, guys. I have it all done. It was virtually impossible to get all the little bits of paper out of all these little grooves. But I think once I put my polyacrylic sealer on it, a lot of those are going to go away and it's going to look perfect. So I'm going to put a top coat on now. And it's finally done and I love it. I know it's not everyone's style to be really chippy and lots of colors like that, but I thought it was really fitting for this graphic. And remember, you can grab this graphic in my Etsy store. Make sure you use the code SAVE50 and you can get 50% off of all of my graphics in there. But look at these colors that are peeking through. It was worth, I'm not going to say how long it took me to rub all that paper off, but it was worth it in the end. And I love it.
All the pieces of wood that I used for this sign were pieces that I found in the dump. They were just salvage pieces that were thrown out, but somehow I just seemed to see the potential in these two pieces of wood and I knew I wanted to make it into an antique sign. I glued the two pieces together and then I painted the whole sign with my homemade chalk paint. While my chalk paint was still wet, I sprinkled the whole piece of wood with coarse salt. When that dries and you sand off the salt, it gives a wonderful vintage look. I'm just using an 80 grit sandpaper on my sander and I'm just really being aggressive and sanding it so it looks really chippy and old. I want it to look like an old reproduction antique sign. And when you're sanding away that salt, it's going to expose the color underneath that I painted, the black color, and it looks fabulous and chippy. When I made these signs last summer, I didn't film me putting the actual graphics on the sign. So I'm going to show you here what the technique is. You print off your signs on your LaserJet or your inkjet. You can use either, and I'll put a link down below in the description comparing the inkjet and the LaserJet methods. You take your Mod Podge and you put a liberal amount over the whole graphic. But don't soak your paper. You just want to cover the whole graphic completely because if you put too much on, it'll cause wrinkles and bubbles. Make sure when you're using this technique, if you're printing it off yourself, to reverse the text. Otherwise, it'll be backwards when you put it on your piece of wood. If you grab these out of my Etsy store, they're already reversed and ready to go. And these graphics are going to go right on the piece of wood over top of the chalk painted surface. I find this technique works the best on chalk paint. I've tried it with latex and I've tried it with acrylic and they both work, but it seems to adhere the best to the chalk paint. And this is all ready to put on the sign. You flip it over, press it on the wood, and then press out all the bubbles and wrinkles, and then you're gonna let it sit overnight. And this is sat overnight. I've dampened it with a rag, and just so you can start to see the letters, and then you're gonna rub away all the excess paper. This takes a little bit of patience and a little bit of practice, and you don't want to wet your paper too much because you will rub away the letters if it gets too wet. So you just keep rubbing until you don't see any pieces of the paper or any white film left on your graphics. With this technique, you're always going to have little bits and pieces that are going to rub away too off the graphic. That's just the way this technique works. And I actually like the look of it. It just kind of gives it more of a distressed look. And now I'm ready to work away on my buy, sell, and trade sign. And this big board came right out of the dump. And after sanding it down, it turned out so rustic and chippy. I just love it. And look how fabulous this turned out. It's so rustic and chippy and antique looking. It's fabulous. And there you have all 3 of the signs all finished, and they look like they were right out of a general store or an antique store. I just can't believe how fantastic they turned out. So get out into your garage, your shed, ask your friends if any of them have any scrap wood. Get them painted with some chalk paint and try out this technique, because you will have a fantastic farmhouse sign.